So I'm Michele, Milner, Director of Learning and Wellbeing at and the Director of Learning and Wellbeing is a number of teams. One of them is educational development, and Veronica is the head of that. I see that I've unhelpfully saved this so that it's changed the font in a way that makes it look very retro. So that perhaps it looks very modern, but perhaps that's an interesting comment on thinking about what's next. So apologies for that. Anyway, we are going to be talking about sort of our particular experience at the RBC, and looking at what's next in terms of what we'd like to be doing. So we'll look, sorry, it's sort of funny looking at a typewriter. Anyway, so it's, oops, sorry, thanks. So we'll just go over a little bit the timeline, and sort of where that brings us up to a little bit so you can understand our institutional context and how blended learning fits into that. Some aspects of our program work specifically around the outputs to do with our strategy and framework, and then challenges that came up post-pandemic and how we address them. And actually, this work was funded, I should say, through a teaching and research award from CODE as well. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just looking at our, can you move that?
That's what I tried to do.
Down to the bottom. But no, that's good. Yeah, fine. Lovely, thank you. See more typewritten things. Anyway, so I think, you know, prior to the pandemic, we didn't have wide use of blended learning. It was very patchy. You had it in some programs, but not all. And I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of our particular makeup of those programs. And like everybody, we went through a phase with emergency remote delivery, just moving to everything being streamed or some such way of delivering it. A bit more planned emphasis in the next phase. And because our students, we have, obviously we have veterinary students, that's our largest cohorts, and we have various entry routes into those programs. But we also have nursing students, and we also have bioscience students as well. So that was interesting actually in that phase, because the veterinary students were considered key workers, so they were allowed to come on campus for their practicals, whereas the bioscience students weren't. So they had a very different experience through that. Then we had the return to campus, of course, all the starts and stops and various things. And then what I'm calling sort of our new normal now. And, oh, sorry, you can just click through the little things underneath each. So more animations, but they're not there and they're not important, never mind. So basically, I think that new normal is really thinking of how students are learning now in terms of how we then think about our teaching. Next slide, I'm interested to see what will happen next. Oh, there they are, okay.
It's just slow on the uptake.
Anyway, and this does, yeah, just click through, I think, put the other bits on there so you can see the full. Charming. Anyway, so this is a way to sort of just give our context really, and thinking about looking at it from in terms of the level of synchrony, or if we think of that more around student-paced versus class-paced learning, and then the emphasis on place. Place-based, coming to campus, coming to a placement provider, for example, or at the other end, virtual. And so what we did as part of the staff development sessions that Veronica and I ran was sort of help staff to understand and situate themselves in that. And you can see that our three main undergraduate programs, although they vary slightly, largely our programs are place-based because of the need to have all of the practical elements, and they're class-paced because the way that they're taught, there isn't a great deal of flexible elements within them. So that was just a way of sort of showing where we're at. We have a few distance programs in the college, but they're very much the minority at the present. And then this, I just want to get that in mind. And this is again something we help people to sort of at the beginning of the pandemic when we were doing workshops to think about where we were with that journey and constructed this sort of way of thinking about blended learning in terms of a more holistic framework. So what are the policies that you would need or standards that you would need to sort of have a consistent approach? How does that relate to our quality standards? Where is our digital infrastructure at? Does it support the things that we want to do? And then those in turn really help us think about where is the capacity to integrate, to innovate and do new things. And of course, how's that influenced by the user experience? So all of these things sort of relate to each other. And what we did was ask staff where they thought we were, again, to try and get people on board. Because I think if you're trying to do something that's a bit new for people, for a lot of staff, that sort of situating things and understanding it's not, obviously, they're very important about teaching choices, but there's also all of the other things that support all of that. And I think at the beginning, most people, and I was sort of happy they realized we were more in a chaotic state, because if they thought we were really up there, then it, you know, you got a bit of a more complicated work to do. So we were sort of in that chaotic reactive state. I would say we're still not in a fully stable state in terms of, you know, and again, a lot to do with the digital infrastructure and how those various systems are integrated to give us a full idea of, say, some of the things, and certainly not in terms of our user experience. Again, it's very patchy because we don't have consistent templates, say, for our VLE that are used across the board. So everything is bespoke in a way that, I use that term generously, is very bespoke in a way that is very labor intensive as well. Next slide. So the program of work then centered on sort of the larger program had 4 work streams, and we'll stay with the first one, the strategy and the framework for blended learning, but we also included developing staff capacity, so that all the staff development work, moving our ABC design workshops, and we were lucky enough to have Professor Laura Larry come to RBC and talk about ABC design workshops, and so we then tried to do those online with some success, and then we had another work stream around learner support. And then the one that you can't see there is around digital infrastructure. So 2 of the big outputs from those, that program of work was a blended learning strategy, and we tried to build on some of the elements of practice that had been part of the curriculum before. So we obviously tried to think about flexible and personalized opportunities, but again, situating that within the class-paced nature of our programs, it meant you had a certain area to work within. Evidence-based, of course, again, thinking about how we could then actually understand how the students were interacting with things to be able to continue to use the technology to enhance. Active and engaging, of course, inclusive and accessible. And because our campuses, our physical spaces had been designed with various social learning spaces that were very, very welcomed by the students, we also wanted to make sure that that was very much a part of what our then blended learning strategy was. So one of the things that we did to help people move from that emergency remote delivery to a more planned way of designing their teaching was to design a rubric. And again, it was based on other standards because we thought that was very important. We did try to move those ABC course design workshops to an online space, which necessarily meant they were sometimes more superficial, I think, in a way. There was some deeper learning, but it's harder, I think, in an online space to sort of be able to kind of say, come back to it. And again, there were, of course, all the time pressures everyone was dealing with. We used Blackboard course design principles to help sort of, again, give some benchmark principles, and trying to think then necessarily about those flexible learning options for students. And again, bearing in mind that we had then, by that time, students who were very unhappy because some of them were able to come on campus and some of them weren't. So that just provided, again, other issues. I think post-pandemic, some of the issues that we sought to address then by the research was to think how we could build on the good parts of that experience, which I'm sure many of us have struggled with. So you had staff that had more confidence with using digital tools, that had more confidence of thinking of flexible elements, but how could we build on that going forward? You also had staff that were very time poor, so didn't necessarily want to keep engaging with those workshops. And you'll see in the survey that there were a lot of external pressures, and also staff felt there were internal pressures that meant that they weren't free to make decisions, so that how they taught wasn't necessarily within their control. We did a bit of a SWOT analysis as we went along with the blended learning, and again, it was very interesting because some of the things that we saw that were quite positive, and again, there's lots of ups and downs, but we did have lots of good student feedback. You had, I think the thing that was sort of really stood out for Veronica and I was staff said, oh, I felt the way we're doing things, there's a deeper amount of learning, the students have different kinds of questions. So these were really positive things that we wanted to build on. But, and obviously these opportunities are sort of some are much more longer term, and some like evidencing success initiatives for the TAP are coming to focus certainly after the pandemic more. But I think we still struggle with that balance and getting the balance right, particularly in our context. And obviously, a murky picture, say externally, so with the 3 conditions and then with the OFS's report on blended learning, how do you square all those circles? And for us, because our main program is very heavily accredited by 8 different bodies, which have slightly different accreditation standards, that became another issue for us. So did we really build on these opportunities? Go ahead, the next one. So I've mentioned a few external pressures. Obviously, all of us experience that real backlash from the media saying, no, face-to-face learning is the only way to go. You don't want to have your students, they all need to be in the lecture hall. And I've purposely shown a picture of an empty lecture hall because I think that's what we have found with a lot of our students, that they're voting with their feet about that a bit. But we also then had real pressure right after the pandemic when we came back face to face, in that our professional body, who, obviously had always monitored how we meet sort of the professional standards, but at that time became quite interested in, are you teaching face to face or online? And so that was a big threat in a way, and it really prompted people to say, oh, okay, everything has to go face to face. Back again. So even learning materials that had been developed and used successfully and staff felt quite happy using, they weren't really sure that they could use it because we were being asked to count the number of hours and to report those. So that was really, really quite difficult, which meant, you can't see it there, but that because we had to count the hours, we had to implement some rather unfriendly change process mechanisms so we could do that. And you'll see in the survey staff really didn't like that, and I don't blame them really. Students, again, one of the big things that came out was that for our students, of course, they've got high stakes assessment. Some of it, there are still a lot of exams, some of it not, but some of it is. And so one of the ideas about if you say used some of the nice little pre-chunked lectures that had been done and done well during the pandemic, but you still ask them to go to a face-to-face one, if that recording had any difference from this recording, oh my goodness, this was a terrible thing, and how is that going to be reconciled? Because what would they study for their exam? Is it this recording or is it that recording? So the way to get around that is say, okay, well then don't use those little chunk recordings, except as an extra resource because it was providing this dissonance. But of course, again, I think the students voted with their feet, and it's been discussed in many conferences that maybe students taught themselves a slightly different way to learn and didn't necessarily feel they had to be there in person to have that in-person learning. And lastly, there's one more little bit there. The staff then are a bit caught in the middle, really. Real pressure for certainty, what should I do, time for, and also just sort of, wanting to build on the knowledge there.
So
over to Veronica now to tell you what we did.
So for the purposes of this, we focused on staff and picking up some of the things that Michele has mentioned. We did that over the summer of 2023, and the aims are on screen here. So it was about thinking about how we can support staff to continue some of those blended learning activities that they have put together, and ensuring that they have the materials that they would like to keep if they could, and how they're going to keep using them. We questioned them around the barriers. Michelle's alluded to some of them, but also interested in finding out whether against the academic group of teachers, whether there were any digital skills barriers which were kind of, having an impact on whether they were going to continue using some of these activities or not. With the goal to then develop a new rubric which is easier for staff to use and to support them with these activities going forward. We, for the purposes of the presentation, have obviously just put a few screenshots in of the types of responses that we got to the questions. We had a response rate of about 40%, which is equivalent to about 80 members of teaching staff. We have just outlined here a few key things around whether they thought that the changes that they had made were effective. So that's the graph on the left-hand side. Some of the things that came through quite strongly were that actually the introduction of more online practicals were beneficial. We have a system that's probably used in many other places called Learning Science, and that's the ability to conduct lab practicals and other simulations from a distance. So that was something that definitely we saw an increase in the use of during this period, and that was something that they felt actually was very effective for their teaching. Again, around the activities that they were designing, but actually it felt that the students were learning more deeply, and also actually giving better questions and asking better questions of their academics and of their lecturers. We have I think it was about just under 80% of our responses said that actually they felt that the changes that they had made were effective. We were then interested to actually, if they felt that, then did they keep on using them? So again, you'll see here that predominantly they felt yes, that actually some of those activities that they had integrated and used, that they were planning on keeping. More of a flipped classroom design came through quite strongly. Our teaching is very much lecture-based in a lot of situations, that students are timetabled to attend lectures for maybe 4 hours a day, with then practical classes kind of feeding into that elsewhere. But actually that more flipped design came through as something that they felt that actually they would want to use, given the caveats that Michele mentioned about actually then that comparison with a face-to-face lecture and a chunk lecture, that was sort of there as well. But across the board, that flipped design was found to be useful. The use of digital resources, Learning Science, as I have mentioned, but also there was a whole range of digital resources that came out and were applicable to the types of courses that we have. And then I think predominant feeling came through about actually changes to teaching style. We have lots of lecturers who deliver the same lecture year on year, but actually this was an opportunity to come in and think about different ways that they deliver their teaching. And as I said here, some of those kept those changes moving forwards. We then asked them about actually, do they think that they have the freedom to use the more flexible learning within their teaching? So again, predominantly most people thought that yes, that was the case. But I'll come on to show you just a few barriers now that actually they felt that maybe for this population here, felt that they didn't have that freedom, what those reasons why they couldn't include that in the teaching, what they might be. So the top line here is around time. Very much it was felt that there were time poor, and creating new resources, including these in this teaching, thinking about tools they could use, has a whole huge time component. So we had lots and lots of people commenting around those types of barriers. The bottom row talks about actually feeling that they weren't allowed to do that. So maybe that, for example, this middle one here is that they may have wanted to have been able to deliver more online content, but felt that they weren't allowed to do it. And again, it was very much that kind of feeling of the rules say that we can't, and they didn't then want to kind of progress that any further. We asked about actually their attitude and desire to learn more, and we gave a whole range of different areas where we could support them, whether this be through workshops, whether this be through different sort of sessions, more resources on our VLE, so more material that they could access at any different time. And you'll see from the, you know, I think we've got every category, at least somebody said, yes, I want to know more about that. Some of these categories, absolutely more. So we felt that given that they may have had more engagement online, that actually they then felt a more didactic teaching session face to face as a lecturer. The students are just sat there listening and not actually engaging. So we had quite a spike in people wanting to know how can we introduce more engagement in our face-to-face lectures. And as a result of that, you know, we've delivered workshops on using polling and all the things that everyone is familiar with, but that came through quite strongly. A couple of the quotes at the bottom here just outline that there was definitely a desire to know more, so more training in all of these areas, but also just more explanation about what's available and how they could use it. We asked about kind of any issues with digital skills, and I think again alluded to that it was just knowing about what tools are available and what's most suitable. If they had more information on that, then that would help them with kind of knowing what was next.
So where we'd like to go now with the new rubric, and again, I don't think we're sort of alone with that, is something that is a bit more nimble for staff to be able to engage with. So something I think that's linked more to the modalities and what the affordances are with that. Because we still have a real difficulty just thinking about where staff would like to, are allowed to inject aspects of flexibility in their teaching. So I think we think that possibly framing that in a slightly different way might be helpful given the constraints. And then obviously the digital skills are part of that to enable that confidence. But of course, it's sitting on top of that really complicated regulatory environment about our B3 conditions and really, you know, the OFS blended learning review was actually had a lot of positive things to say, but how is that being taken up and looked at across the sector? And that's all for me.